The first sign that something was wrong came in the form of a folded slip of paper taped to my front door. In bold letters, it read, "You are in violation of HOA standards. Immediate correction required." At first, I thought it was a mistake. My wife and I had only recently moved into the neighborhood. We kept the yard trimmed, painted the house, and followed the rules as best we understood them. But according to the note, our porch light was the wrong color temperature. Yes, they claimed our warm glow bulb was against HOA policy. Before we dive in, comment which country you're watching from. Let's see how far this story travels. I laughed it off, tossed the note, and thought that was the end of it. But the next week, another notice arrived, then another. Suddenly, everything about my house was non-compliant. The mailbox was half an inch too high, the blinds weren't uniform with the neighbors. Even the flowers in our garden were not within the approved color scheme. That's when Sandra, the HOA president, showed up in person. She marched up my driveway with a clipboard, tapping her pen like a judge about to hand down a sentence. "Mr. Carter," she began, not even bothering with a greeting, "this community has rules. You and your wife will need to fall in line if you want to stay." Her tone made my stomach turn. I asked her politely to explain what falling in line meant, and she replied, "Conformity. We expect homeowners to maintain uniformity. That's what preserves our property values." I could hardly believe it. We weren't breaking laws, we weren't causing trouble. Yet here was this woman acting like she had the authority of a courtroom. I pushed back. "Sandra, we own this home. You can't just bully us into living the way you want." Her eyes narrowed. "Watch me." Then she spun on her heel and left. That night, I told my wife about the confrontation. She listened quietly, her expression calm, but I could see her jaw tighten. She had dealt with worse in her Navy career, far worse. And she wasn't about to let some clipboard warrior try to intimidate us. I didn't know it then, but the HOA had just declared war on the wrong family. 2 days later, a letter slid into my mailbox with big red letters stamped across the top. Final notice. Eviction hearing. The HOA was trying to kick us out of our own home. I couldn't believe it. My wife and I paid our mortgage on time, followed every real city ordinance, and yet here this self-appointed group was threatening to put us on the street. We were summoned to the clubhouse for a mandatory compliance hearing. The moment we walked in, I knew the deck was stacked against us. Sandra sat at the head of a long table, flanked by her loyal board members. Tony, the so-called HOA cop, leaned in the corner with his arms crossed, trying to look intimidating. Sandra didn't waste a second. "Mr. and Mrs. Carter," she said, her voice dripping with superiority, "your repeated violations leave us no choice but to proceed with eviction. Unless you agree to sell your property back to the HOA at a reduced rate, we will file papers with the county." That was the moment my wife stood up. She was calm, collected, and in full uniform. Navy blues, metal shining, posture sharp enough to cut glass. The room went silent. Sandra's smug grin faltered for the first time. "And what exactly," she stammered, "do you think that proves?" My wife's voice was steady, authoritative. "It proves that you're dealing with someone who has sworn to uphold the Constitution of the United States. And last I checked, HOA rules do not override federal or state law." She pulled a folder from her bag and slid it across the table. Inside were copies of Virginia's Property Owners Association Act, which clearly states that HOAs cannot force homeowners to sell, nor can they fabricate fines for aesthetic preferences outside of written bylaws. She had highlighted every relevant section. Tony muttered, "You can't just," but my wife cut him off with a glare that could freeze fire. "If you're enjoying this HOA story so far, like and subscribe, because the story is only going to get better." Sandra's face turned red, but my wife wasn't finished. "You've harassed us with fake violations, threatened us with illegal eviction, and you've stepped way outside the scope of your authority. If you push this any further, you won't just be facing us. You'll be facing military lawyers, state regulators, and possibly the Department of Justice." The silence in that room was deafening. For once, Sandra didn't have a snappy comeback. Her board members shifted uncomfortably, suddenly realizing they weren't as untouchable as they thought. We walked out of the clubhouse that night knowing the tide had turned. They weren't going to back down easily, but they had just learned a hard lesson. We weren't neighbors they could bully. We were a family that fought back. After that HOA meeting, I thought maybe Sandra and Tony would cool off. I was wrong. Tony ramped things up, driving past our house slower than usual, glaring, and then making it obvious he was targeting us. Twice I found our trash can knocked over into the street, dented like it had been hit. Then our mailbox started showing fresh scrapes and bends. The pattern was too clear to ignore, so I mounted a camera across the porch. It didn't take long to catch him in the act. Tony, in his so-called HOA cop vest, nudging his truck against the mailbox and laughing. Sometimes Sandra's voice echoed in the background, egging him on. I wanted to storm over, but instead I stayed calm. We had proof now, and I knew it would matter. The very next week, Sandra and Tony doubled down. Instead of backing off, they filed what they called an official complaint with the county, claiming we were a threat to the neighborhood's safety. It sounded laughable, but I knew these two thrived on pushing boundaries. Sure enough, a few days later, two sheriff's cruisers rolled up outside my house, lights flashing. My stomach dropped for a moment. This was exactly the kind of stunt Sandra loved. The deputies approached professionally, clipboards in hand. Mr. Carter, we've received reports that you've been intimidating HOA board members and disregarding neighborhood regulations, one said. I didn't even bother arguing. I just motioned to my wife, who stepped outside in her Navy uniform. She handed them a binder thick with evidence, time-stamped photos of my compliance, copies of their bogus violation letters, and most importantly, documentation of Tony vandalizing my property. The deputies looked through it, eyebrows raised. One asked quietly, "Do you have video?" I nodded and pulled out my phone. The clip played clearly. Tony, in his self-appointed HOA cop vest, deliberately backing his truck over my trash can and mailbox. Sandra's voice could even be heard egging him on. That changed everything. The deputies turned on their heels. "Mr. Carter, it looks like you've been the victim here. Let's have a word with your neighbors." Sandra and Tony, who had been smirking from across the street, straightened nervously as the deputies walked over. The first deputy spoke firmly. "Mr. Reynolds, under 18 U.S. Code 1705, willful destruction of a mailbox is a federal crime, punishable by up to 3 years in prison and fines up to $250,000. We've seen video evidence of you committing this multiple times." Tony's mouth dropped. "It was an accident." "5 accidents?" The deputy shot back. "We'll let the postal inspector decide. For now, you're being cited for criminal mischief and referred for federal review." They slapped him with a misdemeanor vandalism citation on the spot, $1,500 in fines due immediately, and told him federal charges could follow. Then came Sandra's turn. The second deputy held up the complaint she'd filed. "Mrs. Hill, filing a knowingly false report is a crime under Virginia Code 18.2-461, punishable by up to 12 months in jail and a $2,500 fine. You accused your neighbor of being a threat without a shred of evidence." Sandra's smug face collapsed. "That's not what I meant." "It's exactly what you signed," the deputy interrupted. "You'll be cited today. Whether this escalates is up to the county attorney." By the time the deputies were done, Tony looked like he'd swallowed glass, and Sandra was pale as chalk. But the fallout didn't stop there. News of the police report spread fast. Neighbors were furious that the HOA leadership had lied, wasted county resources, and tried to railroad a military family. At the next meeting, 3 board members resigned on the spot, including Sandra. The county later confirmed the HOA's selective enforcement and harassment opened them up to civil liability. A lawsuit was filed by multiple families, and the HOA's legal defense fund drained overnight. Tony, meanwhile, ended up paying nearly $8,000 in fines and damages between county citations and restitution for my mailbox. Sandra never regained her influence. The HOA was stripped of much of its authority after the investigation, and for the first time in months, my street was quiet. Justice, it turned out, didn't just arrive, it backed in with flashing lights. And that's how Sandra and Tony's little reign of intimidation finally came crashing down. What do you think, folks? Did they get what they deserved? Or should the consequences have been even tougher? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear how you would have handled this HOA madness.